Breaking. Crimea is burning tonight. The heart of Russia's military stronghold has been turned into a field of fire and twisted steel after one of the most devastating Ukrainian strikes since the start of the war. Explosions lit up the night sky as entire command posts and ammunition depots vanished in flames. What happened was not a random attack. It was a calculated trap. Ukraine waited, watched, and struck at the exact moment Russian commanders gathered inside their so-called secure bases. The result was total chaos and destruction. Videos from local residents showed enormous fireballs rising into the air, followed by shockwaves that shattered windows miles away. Sevastopol, Saki, Jankoy, names that once symbolized Russian control were now engulfed in smoke and fear. Emergency sirens wailed through the night as Russian troops scrambled for cover. The world saw it unfold in real time. What was supposed to be Russia's safest region had just become a disaster zone. According to multiple intelligence sources, Ukraine had been monitoring Russian movements for weeks. Drones hovered quietly over the Crimean sky. Satellites traced every convoy and communication signal. Ukrainian intelligence discovered that several high-ranking officers were meeting inside a major command compound. They waited until the moment every one of them was inside. Then the order was given. Within seconds, the first 1150kg Flamingo Warhead hit. The ground shook. A blinding orange flash filled the night, followed by an eruption so violent it could be seen from across the Black Sea. Then came another strike. And another. Within 15 minutes, more than 20 separate targets were hit. The Flamingo Warheads are not ordinary bombs. Each one carries over a ton of explosive force capable of tearing through reinforced bunkers and detonating any ammunition stored nearby. When they hit, they don't just destroy, they obliterate. The blast wave was so intense that it vaporized entire sections of concrete walls and turned armored vehicles into melted wrecks. Ukrainian officials later confirmed that these weapons were part of a new precision-guided system developed with Western assistance. Every strike was planned down to the meter. Russian state media tried to contain the panic. They claimed it was a small explosion at a fuel depot, but the truth was impossible to hide. Satellite photos quickly revealed the scale of destruction. Massive craters scarred the ground where command buildings once stood. Military bloggers inside Russia began posting frantic messages before their accounts suddenly went silent. For the first time, even loyal propagandists admitted what Moscow didn't want to say out loud. Ukraine had broken through Russia's illusion of control in Crimea. Witnesses spoke of soldiers abandoning their positions, vehicles left behind, and entire units disappearing in the chaos. Some reports even suggested that several top officers were killed in the blast. The Kremlin refused to confirm, but the sudden absence of key military figures told its own story. Panic spread not only across the base, but across the entire peninsula. Civilians rushed toward the Kerch Bridge trying to escape, forming endless traffic jams that stretched for miles. Police were deployed to block exits and prevent soldiers from fleeing disguised as civilians. But fear was unstoppable. It spread faster than any command from Moscow. By morning, the fires were still burning. Thick black smoke rose over Crimea's western coast as Russian firefighters worked desperately to contain the infernos. But what burned that night was more than fuel and ammunition. It was the myth of Russian invincibility. Crimea had been the symbol of Moscow's power, the crown jewel of its empire. Now it was the stage of its humiliation. And all it took was patience, precision, and a weapon Ukraine was never supposed to have. Analysts say the operation was timed with extraordinary precision. The moment Russia's commanders arrived, communication signals were intercepted and tracked. Ukraine had eyes everywhere. The entire attack was executed so quickly that Russian air defense systems had no chance to respond. Dozens of S-400 batteries were present in Crimea, but none of them fired a single effective shot. They never even saw the missiles coming. In Moscow, the silence was deafening. State television avoided mentioning the incident. The Ministry of Defense issued a vague statement calling it an act of sabotage, refusing to admit the scale of the losses. But internally, sources say panic swept through the chain of command. The central communication links between Crimea and southern Russia went dark for hours. Reports from the front lines stopped coming. Entire brigades were suddenly cut off, with no orders, no supplies, and no leadership. What makes this strike even more remarkable is that Ukraine didn't act in haste. They had been tracking, calculating, waiting for the perfect storm. Intelligence sources from Kiev describe months of observation, signal interception, and preparation. The goal was not only to destroy but to send a message. Nowhere in occupied territory is safe anymore. The patience paid off. Russia fell right into the trap it never saw coming. This was not just another attack, it was a statement. It proved that Ukraine could hit the very heart of Russia's military command structure and do so with absolute precision. It exposed the cracks inside Putin's war machine and shattered the belief that Crimea could ever be defended. For years, the Kremlin built its propaganda on the idea that Crimea was untouchable. Tonight, that illusion lies in ruins. Now the question hanging over Moscow is simple yet terrifying. If Ukraine can do this here, what can they do next? If the Flamingo Warheads could erase an entire command center in minutes, how long before they strike deeper, perhaps inside Russia itself? The psychological impact of this night will echo far beyond Crimea. The panic, the confusion, the disbelief, it all marks a turning point. This is just the beginning of what could be the most significant collapse in Russia's southern front since the war began. But how did Ukraine manage to pull this off so perfectly? What kind of coordination and intelligence network allowed them to hit 20 critical targets in one night without a single leak? The answers will leave the Kremlin speechless and may change the course of this entire war. Stay with us, because the next part reveals the shocking strategy behind Ukraine's flawless trap. What unfolded that night in Crimea was not a coincidence. It was the product of months of intelligence work, secret coordination, and the kind of precision warfare that Russia never believed Ukraine was capable of. Behind the chaos, there was a plan so meticulously calculated that even NATO analysts called it one of the most brilliant operations of the war. Ukraine didn't simply fire missiles at random. They built a trap, waited for the exact moment when Russia's top command would be inside their fortified bases, and then unleashed the full fury of their Flamingo warheads. Weeks before the attack, Ukrainian drones disguised as civilian aircraft began mapping the Crimean airspace. They studied radar gaps, missile coverage zones, and the timing of Russian patrols. Signals intelligence teams in Kyiv, working alongside Western advisors, intercepted encrypted Russian communications, tracking conversations between senior officers. Those intercepts revealed something extraordinary. Russian commanders were planning a major strategy meeting inside the Sevastopol base complex. That meeting would bring together nearly every regional commander operating in southern Ukraine. In other words, the entire chain of command was about to gather in one place. That is when Ukraine's patience began to pay off. Military analysts say the Flamingo operation was coordinated by a small elite group within the Ukrainian General Staff, known internally as Unit F. Their job was to plan long-range precision strikes that combined local, resistance intelligence with NATO surveillance data. The idea was simple yet devastating. Wait until the enemy concentrates, then strike once with overwhelming force. According to sources close to the operation, Ukraine had prepared more than 30 Flamingo warheads, each equipped with advanced infrared guidance and satellite correction, capable of hitting within 2 meters of its intended target. To hide the buildup, Ukrainian forces launched small drone attacks across Kherson and Melitopol in the days leading up to the main strike. Those minor assaults distracted Russian radar operators, forcing them to redeploy air defense systems northward. It was classic misdirection. When the night of the operation arrived, Russia's southern radar coverage had massive blind spots, leaving Crimea exposed. At that moment, Ukraine's air force prepared its strike packages. Modified Su-24 and MiG-29 jets carried the Flamingo warheads at low altitude, staying below Russian detection range. Once the target coordinates were confirmed, the jets climbed briefly, released the weapons, and turned back before any Russian radar could lock on. At 2:43 inches the morning, the first Flamingo hit. Within seconds, the entire command center erupted in flames. Reports from Ukrainian intelligence described what happened next as a chain reaction of explosions that tore through bunkers, fuel tanks, and ammunition caches. The second and third strikes targeted communications nodes and radar installations, cutting off Russian command ability almost instantly. When the fourth and fifth Flamingo warheads hit, they destroyed the power grids that supplied the base. Within 15 minutes, the entire complex had gone silent. The precision was so surgical that Ukrainian forces could hear intercepted Russian transmissions filled with panic. One surviving officer screamed for backup that would never come. Another shouted that their headquarters had disappeared. Russian rescue teams attempted to reach the site, but found entire roads blocked by wreckage. Fire spread rapidly, as secondary explosions triggered ammunition stores to detonate one by one. Witnesses described shockwaves so powerful they knocked down walls miles away. Russian social media lit up with confusion. Some channels posted photos of orange fireballs rising over the horizon, while others insisted it was a controlled detonation. But when daylight came, the truth could not be denied. Satellite imagery revealed an enormous crater where the command building once stood. Entire blocks of infrastructure were gone. Every communication antenna had been wiped out. The Sevastopol air defense radar, once hailed as the most advanced in the region, was reduced to ashes. Inside Moscow, the chain of command fractured. Reports stopped flowing from Crimea. The central command center in Rostov could no longer reach units deployed on the peninsula. For several hours, Russian field commanders operated completely blind. Ukrainian artillery used that blackout to advance along the southern front, targeting convoys that tried to retreat from the peninsula. In essence, the Flamingo strikes didn't just destroy buildings, they decapitated the Russian command structure in the entire south. Western military observers believe the Flamingo weapon was developed through a collaboration of Ukrainian engineers and NATO experts. Its key feature is its stealth and speed. Unlike conventional bombs, the Flamingo travels at nearly 3 times the speed of sound and descends in a sharp vertical dive, making interception almost impossible. The 1150kg warhead contains a new composite explosive that burns hotter and longer than anything previously seen on the battlefield. The heat alone can melt steel and concrete, which explains why rescue operations in Crimea were nearly impossible for days. The shock inside Russia was immediate. Within hours, military bloggers began blaming the Ministry of Defense for incompetence. Some accused generals of corruption, claiming they had pocketed funds meant for air defense upgrades. Others went further, suggesting that inside help from Russian officers may have leaked details to Ukraine. That possibility sent the Kremlin into a frenzy. Security services launched internal investigations, detaining dozens of officers suspected of disloyalty. The panic was so severe that flights out of Crimea were grounded for nearly 48 hours. Meanwhile, Ukraine celebrated quietly. There were no triumphant statements, no flashy declarations, just a short, cryptic message from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. "We warned you that Crimea is not safe." That single sentence spread across social media like wildfire. It wasn't just a message to Moscow. It was a message to every Russian soldier stationed in occupied territory. The ground beneath your feet can explode at any moment. By the second day, footage from Sevastopol showed smoldering ruins where the command complex once stood. Firefighters worked around the clock, but the scale of destruction made their efforts look hopeless. Local residents were ordered to evacuate, fearing toxic fumes from the burning fuel and ammunition. The once proud base that controlled the entire southern front had become an open graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. For Ukraine, this operation was a strategic masterpiece. It crippled Russia's ability to coordinate in the south and sent a psychological shockwave through the Kremlin. For Russia, it was a humiliation that exposed every weakness in its defenses. One senior NATO official summed it up perfectly. This was not just a strike. It was a statement that Russia's empire is crumbling from the inside. But the story doesn't end here. What happened in Crimea that night triggered something much bigger, an aftershock that rippled through every Russian base across the region. Soldiers began abandoning posts, convoys turned back mid-route, and even Moscow's most loyal allies started questioning how such a catastrophic failure was possible. The Kremlin's nightmare was only beginning, because what followed this attack was not just panic, it was the start of a chain reaction that could collapse Russia's entire southern front. And the world was about to watch it unfold in real time. As the fires in Crimea still burned, the shockwaves were already spreading far beyond the peninsula. Across Russia's southern front, confusion turned into full-scale panic. The Flamingo strike didn't just destroy buildings, it shattered communication lines, command structures, and the very belief that the Kremlin had control. Soldiers on the ground suddenly found themselves cut off from headquarters, unable to receive orders, unsure who was still alive. What followed was the kind of collapse no army wants to face in the middle of a war. Field reports from Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Mariupol described the same scene. Russian troops abandoning equipment, retreating without coordination, and convoys turning back because no one was answering their calls. The once tightly controlled Russian logistics network simply stopped working. Fuel supplies were stranded on the wrong side of the Dnipro River. Ammunition shipments disappeared into chaos. Even medical evacuation routes were paralyzed. It was as if the entire southern war machine had suddenly gone blind. And while the Russian army was scrambling to regain its footing, Ukraine moved fast. Within 24 hours of the Flamingo operation, Ukrainian artillery began pounding secondary Russian positions across the front line. Without radar guidance from Crimea, Russian forces couldn't identify where the strikes were coming from. Ukrainian drones picked off stranded vehicles, command tents, and mobile missile launchers one by one. Every explosion on the ground reminded Russian soldiers that their leadership had vanished. The attack on Crimea had turned the southern front into a battlefield of confusion. Inside Moscow, the situation was spiraling. Reports of missing officers and destroyed command centers flooded in. The Ministry of Defense held emergency meetings, but even Putin's closest advisors struggled to piece together what had happened. State TV tried to stay silent, but within hours, the story leaked through social media and independent telegram channels. Footage of massive explosions and satellite images of burned-out bases were circulating worldwide. The Kremlin's narrative of full control was gone. In an attempt to contain the panic, Moscow deployed Rosgvardia units to Crimea, labeling them security reinforcements. But locals saw the truth. These weren't reinforcements, they were riot control forces sent to suppress desertion. Thousands of Russian soldiers were trying to flee the peninsula. Some even stole civilian cars and boats in desperation to cross the Kerch Strait. Witnesses described long lines of troops abandoning their posts, terrified that more Flamingo strikes could hit at any moment. Meanwhile, the psychological damage spread faster than the explosions themselves. Russian military channels filled with messages from soldiers begging to be rotated out of Crimea. Families of officers demanded answers about missing loved ones. For the first time since the war began, the fear wasn't just at the front, it had reached the homes of Russian families deep inside the country. The illusion of safety was gone. And then came the international reaction. NATO intelligence confirmed what Ukraine had achieved. The strike had eliminated several high-ranking Russian officers and destroyed the primary communication hub linking Crimea to the southern front. American and British defense officials praised the precision and planning behind the operation, calling it a turning point in modern warfare. In Brussels, NATO representatives publicly warned Russia that continued aggression would only bring more unprecedented consequences. The message was clear. Ukraine now had the upper hand. Even China and India, two of Russia's most cautious partners, reportedly expressed concerns in private diplomatic channels. The Kremlin, already weakened by economic sanctions and military setbacks, suddenly found itself more isolated than ever. And while Moscow's diplomats scrambled to downplay the disaster, Putin's inner circle was cracking. Intelligence leaks later revealed fierce arguments inside the Kremlin, with generals blaming one another for the failure and security chiefs accusing others of betrayal. The word mutiny began appearing again in Russian military blogs. Several sources claimed that mid-level officers in Crimea refused to follow orders after realizing the central command had been wiped out. Small skirmishes reportedly broke out between regular army units and internal security forces sent to restore order. What had started as a single precision strike was now morphing into a crisis of command and loyalty. Ukraine, meanwhile, didn't stop. They released a second statement. Every invader in Crimea will meet the same fate. That single sentence was enough to send another wave of panic through Russian troops stationed across the peninsula. Reports of mass withdrawals and spontaneous evacuations flooded in from multiple sectors. Even the once mighty Black Sea Fleet began moving its ships away from Sevastopol towards safer waters near Novorossiysk. The same fleet that once blockaded Ukraine was now fleeing from its own base. Western analysts called it the Crimea domino effect. One decisive strike had triggered a collapse in morale, logistics, and confidence across an entire front. For Russia, the symbolism was devastating. Crimea was supposed to be proof of strength, the jewel of the empire reclaimed in 2014. But now, it had become the graveyard of that very empire. Every plume of smoke over Sevastopol was a reminder to the world that Moscow's grip was slipping. By the third day, the Kremlin finally broke its silence. A visibly shaken spokesman announced that measures are being taken, and that the situation is under control. But nobody believed it. The footage from Crimea said otherwise. Columns of smoke still rose from burning bases, and satellite images showed Russian convoys retreating north. The myth of control had collapsed, replaced by the reality of defeat. Even within Russia, people began whispering about the unthinkable. Could this be the beginning of the end? Was Crimea the point where the entire war turned against Moscow? For months, Russia had projected confidence, claiming that time was on its side. But after the Flamingo strikes, time became its enemy. Supplies dwindled, morale vanished, and political cracks began to widen. The empire that once threatened Europe now couldn't even secure its own territory. And yet, In Kyiv, the mood was quiet but determined. There was no boasting, no public celebration, only a clear sense of purpose. Ukraine had shown the world that strategy could defeat size, that patience could crush arrogance, and that even the most fortified empire could crumble when faced with precision and resolve. For millions watching around the world, the message was unmistakable. The war had entered a new phase. The battlefield was no longer about territory, it was about psychology, perception, and control. Ukraine had taken the initiative, and Russia was running out of moves. But the question that now haunts the Kremlin is the one that keeps generals awake at night. If Ukraine could pull this off in Crimea, what could they do next? Could the next Flamingo strike target deeper inside Russia, perhaps near its border command centers? Could Moscow itself soon hear the same sirens that echoed through Sevastopol? One thing is certain. The Flamingo operation has rewritten the rules of this war. It proved that no fortress is too strong, no commander too safe, and no empire too large to fall. Russia is now facing a crisis of confidence it cannot fix with propaganda or threats. And as Ukraine continues to push forward, one chilling truth remains. This is only the beginning of Moscow's nightmare. The next moves could decide not just the fate of Crimea, but the future of Russia itself. So, what happens now? Can the Kremlin recover from this catastrophic blow, or is this the first crack in an empire that's starting to collapse from within? Let us know what you think in the comments, share this story, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because the next strike might change everything again. The aftermath of the Flamingo strike is now being called the darkest week in modern Russian history. Not because of the number of explosions, but because of what those explosions revealed. They didn't just expose military weakness, they exposed the cracks inside Russia itself, cracks that even the Kremlin can no longer hide. What began as a single night of destruction in Crimea has now spiraled into a national reckoning. Across Russia, panic is spreading quietly but powerfully. In Moscow, lines of worried families form outside army offices, desperate to learn whether their sons and husbands were in Crimea during the strike. Social media is flooded with posts from soldiers describing chaos, vanished officers, and entire brigades gone silent. Some messages are quickly deleted, others reposted faster than the censors can react. Even state journalists, normally obedient, have begun slipping questions into broadcasts that would have been unthinkable a month ago. How could this happen, they ask. Where was our air defense? Who gave the order that led our commanders into that trap? Behind closed doors, anger is boiling. Reports from inside the Kremlin describe a climate of suspicion and fear. Generals are blaming intelligence chiefs, and intelligence chiefs are blaming the military. Nobody wants to be the one who failed to protect Crimea. Putin, sources say, erupted in fury when he saw satellite images of the destroyed bases. He demanded names, arrests, and answers. But the truth was impossible to spin. The Flamingo strike didn't just hit military targets. It hit the very heart of Russia's image as a superpower. Meanwhile, on the streets, the fear is no longer limited to the front lines. Videos from St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, and even Moscow show people hoarding fuel, withdrawing cash, and rushing to supermarkets. Rumors of new Ukrainian weapons are spreading faster than official statements can contain them. Some whisper that the next attack could reach deep inside Russia. Others talk of conscription waves, of new mobilization orders, of sons being sent to fight in a war that feels less and less winnable. For the first time, cracks are visible in the facade of Russian propaganda. Influential bloggers and former soldiers are openly questioning the leadership. A well-known war correspondent said in a now-deleted post, "We lost not because of enemy weapons, but because our system rotted from within." That single sentence captured what millions of Russians are starting to feel, the realization that this war is bleeding them from the inside. Internationally, the response has been immediate and fierce. Western intelligence agencies hailed Ukraine's success as proof that modern warfare is about precision and patience, not size and intimidation. Washington and London released synchronized statements praising Kyiv's discipline and innovation. In Brussels, NATO announced new intelligence-sharing measures to ensure Ukraine could maintain the momentum. The alliance, once hesitant, now speaks with renewed confidence. Even nations that had kept their distance from the conflict, such as Japan and South Korea, quietly pledged additional aid. Meanwhile, Russia's allies are going silent. China has refused to publicly support Moscow's version of events. India has avoided comment altogether. Even Belarus, long considered a loyal partner, is reportedly limiting its cooperation after seeing the scale of the disaster. Behind the scenes, European diplomats say Moscow's trading partners are nervous, wondering if they should distance themselves before sanctions tighten further. The Flamingo strike didn't just damage Russian military infrastructure. It damaged Russia's credibility as a partner, an ally, and a power. Inside Ukraine, morale has never been higher. In Kiev, crowds gathered quietly near the Independence Monument, lighting candles for soldiers and cheering as footage of the explosions circulated online. No one shouted, no one boasted, but the sense of vindication was undeniable. For months, Ukraine endured drone attacks, missile strikes, and blackouts. Now the tables have turned. The message was clear. The hunter had become the hunted. Military analysts around the world are calling this the turning point of the war. The Flamingo strike showed that Russia's fortress strategy is crumbling. The once untouchable bases of Crimea are no longer safe. The chain of command is fractured, logistics are collapsing, and morale is disintegrating. In the words of one Western general, "What Ukraine achieved in one night, Russia cannot fix in a year." The long-term consequences are beginning to unfold. Moscow's economy, already strained by sanctions, is now under additional pressure as billions of rubles are redirected to rebuild what was lost. Insurance rates for ships entering the Black Sea have skyrocketed. Trade routes through Crimea are frozen. Even the symbolic Kerch Bridge, still standing but heavily guarded, is now a reminder of vulnerability rather than power. Every passing day erodes Russia's ability to sustain this war, and deep inside the Kremlin, that reality is beginning to sink in. Sources close to Putin's inner circle say that paranoia has reached new heights. Officials are being monitored, phones tapped, and meetings limited to a handful of trusted aides. Some ministers reportedly fear a purge. Others whisper about an exit plan. The once invincible image of unity around Putin is fracturing. Every decision now carries the shadow of doubt. Every word could be seen as betrayal. And while Moscow descends into internal chaos, Ukraine continues to advance not recklessly, but with cold precision. Each move is calculated to expose another weakness, another blind spot in Russia's crumbling defenses. The Flamingo strike was not an isolated victory. It was a signal of what's coming next. Every success now builds on the panic that night unleashed. Every explosion that followed is another echo of Crimea's downfall. For ordinary Russians, the fear has become something new. It's not just fear of losing a war, it's the fear of realizing they were lied to, that the empire they were told was rising is instead falling apart. Conversations that once happened in secret now happen in whispers on the streets, in markets, in coffee shops. The question is no longer whether Russia can win, it's how long it can hold itself together. The world is watching closely. Western analysts predict that the next few months could redefine not only the war but the entire balance of power in Eastern Europe. If Russia cannot secure Crimea, it cannot secure its borders. And if it cannot secure its borders, it cannot maintain its empire. History may look back at the Flamingo strike as the moment everything changed, the night when Russia's illusion of control turned to smoke. So as we end this report, one question remains. Can the Kremlin recover from this disaster, or has Ukraine already written the first line in the story of Russia's unraveling? The answer will shape not just the future of this war, but the future of Europe itself. If you've made it this far, tell us what you think in the comments. Do you believe Russia can still turn the tide? Or is this the beginning of its final collapse? Share this video, subscribe for updates, and stay with us. Because what happens next could rewrite the course of history.